town as well?
I do, yeah, my wife and I are on Miami Trail, which is off in Northridge.
Oh, okay.
It's like if you go out past the post office.
Yep.
You take a left, there's, several neighborhoods back
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
School board now, maybe.
God.
Yeah.
I don't know how long you've been living in Oxford.
I grew up here.
Oh, okay.
My wife and I are Miami mergers.
Oh,
She
hey.
came here for grad school, met the local guy, and then never left, right? So she's from Wisconsin originally.
Hey, that's very good. That's
Yeah,
great.
And she works in the farmer school business.
Oh, got it.
Yeah. And then we have 3 kids and live here locally, so
Got it. How, one of your kids is 13?
13, 11, and 6.
Okay. Busy household then.
Very much so.
Yeah.
How about you? You guys have kids or
No kids, yeah.
Gotcha.
And then,
Enjoy the peace.
that's right. Try to make the most of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You work in town as well, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
But right now I'm working from home. Just got an office space.
Okay.
We'll see. And recently sort of self-employed.
I may have to rotate some of them, speak from them, but I can rotate them around the second fellow block.
Did Matt say he was coming?
He is not going to be at this meeting.
Oh, okay.
He has an excused absence.
That's allowed?
Yeah. What's an excused absence? They gotta get me to the list.
Yeah, what did he have to get you? Was that,
Just a reasonable explanation.
Oh, okay.
Travel-related challenges.
Sure.
That's reasonable. Yeah. Well done.
For sure.
Okay. In GIS, we call this buffering.
Right.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 1 week. Yep.
Just waiting for Mr. Kennard to get his office set up. I'm ready when you are. I'm ready. It is 6:31, so let's call the Tuesday, January 28th, 2025 meeting of the Oxford Board of Zoning Appeals to order. First item of business is election of officers and swearing in of BZA members.
You entertain a motion?
So I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move to appoint Mr. Russo as chair.
I'll second that motion.
Second or third?
Any other nominations? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed, abstentions? Thank you, or maybe not. Second order of business is swearing in of BZA members. Mr. Kennard, would you do the honors for us?
I would, if everyone would please rise. I apologize for my voice. Raise your right hand, please. I state your name.
I, Freddie Russo,
Solemnly swear
solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
That
That I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the state of Ohio,
and the state of Ohio,
and will obey the laws thereof,
and will obey the laws thereof,
and that I will,
and I will,
in all respects,
in all respects,
uphold and enforce
uphold and enforce
the provisions of the Charter
the provisions of the Charter
and ordinances of the city of Oxford,
and ordinances of the city of Oxford,
and will faithfully discharge
and will faithfully discharge
the duties of the Board of Zoning Appeals
the duties of the Board of Zoning Appeals
of the City of Oxford,
of the City of Oxford,
upon which I am a member.
upon which I am a member.
You are hereby sworn in. Thank you.
Sign the forms and pass them down to.
Pass them down for notary.
We have to elect vice chair. I'll make a motion to nominate Mr. Smith as vice chair.
I second the motion.
It's been moved and seconded. Any other nominations? Hearing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Abstentions? 4-0. Congratulations.
Thank you, I accept.
Next item on the agenda is approval of the October 22nd, 2024 minutes of the regular meeting. You have those in your packet. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Been moved,
Second.
seconded. Any discussions on modifications, changes, alterations? Hearing none. All in favor of accepting the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The minutes have been approved. New business, BZA 2024-06, 417 Withrow Street, variance to section 1143.07C, maximum lot coverage. Zach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bear with me just one moment. I'll get this fired up here on the projector. Thank you.
Chris, you want to put my position on the
Sure. The chair would allow
Who's this gentleman?
Mr. Grove to speak on a matter that the board needs to be aware of.
Good evening. My name's Jack Grove, and I'm an attorney for the property owner. And before this particular meeting, Mr. Conard and I have been in close communication having to do with some of the legal issues. And you just took an oath and agreed to abide by the laws of the state of Ohio and the constitutions and the city ordinances. And there's an issue having to do with the primacy of the law of the state of Ohio in relation to the city ordinance, which is the enabling ordinance that directs you on how to conduct your meeting. And the subject ordinance is Oxford Ordinance 113902 C2, and it directs the board to determine, without regard to the existence of variances or nonconformities on other land sites or structures not presently under consideration. And I think you already had Mr. Moore's staff report, and he goes into some background having to do with past precedent of the board. There are several cases from the Ohio Supreme Court that indicate that past precedent is important and is available for consideration. And we have contended, not only in the context of this matter, but in the broader realm, that that ordinance is invalid and it's void for vagueness. And there's a leading case from 2023.
Jack, I thought you were going to get into the law.
Well, I just wanted to get into the record. So it's called Compass Homes versus Upper Arlington Zoning Board. The cases from the Ohio Supreme Court that direct consideration of past precedent. The first case is Keisel versus Sandusky, which really creates the standard practical difficulty for area variances. That was followed by the Duncan versus Middlefield case, and that's the criteria, set of criteria, and it acknowledges that other matters may be considered, and past precedent being one of them. It wasn't present in that case, but the Supreme Court said it's available for consideration. And then a more recent case in 2013 is Boyce versus the Village of Ottawa Hills. And it emphasized that there are constitutional implications if there's disparate treatment. So you're going to hear considerable evidence tonight having to do with the neighborhood, like-kind practices on similarly situated properties, all of which we think are appropriate for consideration. And I appreciate Mr. Moore citing, it took some research on his part to get into some of the past precedent. So I just wanted to put that on the record. Anything comes up later on in the evening, I might have something to say, and I'll raise my hand, and if you can just pause while I state an objection. I don't know that there will be many, but anyway, thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Chris, do you have a layer on that? Yep.
And make it a little bit more simplistic. The 12th District Court of Appeals, in which this city of Oxford, Butler County is part of, issued a decision. I think Mr. Grove was part of it. And the issue is whether or not past variances that have been granted or denied is relevant to the BZA. The case that was before the 12th District, the BZA member, a BZA member unilaterally raised evidence from a previous case that had been not introduced into the record. As you know, information is presented, you hear the evidence. You are only allowed to confine yourself to the four corners of the evidence presented in this quasi-judicial hearing. So you are not allowed to take information from outside and bring it in, even though you may know it. So as a result of that, I think before Mr. Moore and Mr. Perry and I were in our respective roles, there was an amendment that was done to the City of Oxford Code that said, that was correct, but didn't go far enough by adding the appropriate secondary clause. And so the code as currently written says you can't consider any other variance has been granted. That's wrong. Mr. Grove is correct on that statement. However, if evidence is introduced of other variances based upon similarly situated properties, which is a question of fact that you would have to determine, then you can consider such evidence. And in the case that you're going to hear today, the staff report reflects other cases, and I'm sure that the applicant is going to address those. Absolutely appropriate. In fact, you should consider that evidence when determining whether or not to grant or deny the variance request as presented. So, does the body have any
questions?
on that?
I sure do. So you're trying to tell us that we're not supposed to follow the code as it's written? Is that what
The
you're telling
code
us?
is written, is incorrect.
Okay,
because it
so
doesn't-
why doesn't council amend the code rather than
We're
have
going
you?
to do that.
Okay, but as of today, it's not amended. So we took an oath to follow the code as it's written.
Well, I'll say this. There is a conflict that exists. Council is going to be amending that code when we bring it to their attention. There's some other things that are going on, and there's being a code rewrite. And I'm simply saying that if, given the state of the law, and what the courts have said, including the 12th District, which would consider, and the Common Pleas Court in 2506 appeal, I'm not gonna tell in an open meeting the BZA what to do. I'm
Sounds
simply-
like to me that's what you're saying.
I'm saying that it exists. And
But
that
you know, I'm a lawyer too, you know case law is many times fact-specific. I don't know the facts of that case, but my personal opinion is until the city council changes the ordinance, or we have a court decision specifically that binds us, I'm gonna follow the code.
I would take a different view of that.
Do you have a sense of timing on when council is going to address this?
I expect that we're having a meeting on Friday and with staff, and I think we're gonna be dealing with the issue. So I think that I would expect.
Would you then recommend that we delay this until council, and that therefore any potential?
Well, okay, so there's another issue. You saw the email from Mr. Moore. The applicant's representative submitted, I think, 126 pages of supplemental material that he wants to have into the record. That was done on late Thursday and Friday, including some additional things on Monday. The BZA rules ask that all submissions be done a week in
that which they must consider. And it's really not appropriate for them to consider matters outside of the hearing or before the hearing. So we would have a procedural objection having to do with presenting matters to them, the precondition to them, because this is what counts. It's what they hear and see here.
You've asked that the record include information as part of the application. That's part of the record, Jack.
Well, but
It's the application is part of the
the
record. not the
application is part of the
evidence.
record, but there's other evidence. For example, other people may show up and give testimony, and that hasn't been provided.
All I'm saying is 126 pages of documents were submitted after the information was passed on to the BZA.
That's not unusual.
I get it. And volume is an issue, okay, because the BZA attempts to be user-friendly to the citizens who appear in front of it.
Well, sure.
So the question that this board is gonna have to ask is, at some point, is whether or not they, in their deliberative capacity, will wanna consider whether or not they need time to review that information. That may be something that you consider as a part of a decision when you get close to public meeting and can start to consider deliberations on whether or not you wanna table it so that you have an opportunity to review this information. That's all I'm saying.
Understood.
Okay, if I could have the projector set to my slideshow. Thank you very much. So again, this is BZA 2024-06. This is
Just
a.
for the record, Zach, would you?
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry, Mr. Chair. Yes, you need to swear me in?
No,
Oh.
I just would like you to state who you are.
He needs to be sworn in.
Okay.
All witnesses.
Mr. Kennard, would you swear in, Zach, please?
Any potential witness here who wants to testify, other than Mr. Grove here is in board capacity, please raise your right hand. You swear affirm to tell the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
I'm Zachary Moore. I'm the city planner and GIS coordinator for the city of Oxford, Ohio. And so, again, this is BZA 2024-06. This is for a requested variance at 417 and 419 East Withrow Street. Basic details of the application. The applicant, as identified on the application form at least, was Mr. Scott Webb, architect, who is with us this evening. The property owner is Trace Walnut LLC, under care of Tom Kakachis, who's also with us this evening. The current zoning district that applies to the property is R3MS. This is a single, 2, and 3 family mile square residential district. The current use of the property is a 3-family dwelling, and that's a fairly recent construction, which I'll get into here in a moment. And the specific variance being requested is to section 1143.07C, subsection C, for maximum lot coverage. And if this variance were granted, it would enable a grandfathered parking area, off-street parking area, to remain on the property. So turning to a location map of the subject property, so it's outlined for you in a black, dark outline here. This particular aerial imagery is from 2023, so this was amidst kind of the final touches on the construction of the building, hence kind of the chaotic nature of what this appears to be as construction is wrapping up. But I will show you some more updated aerial imagery as well as drone imagery that shows more or less the existing condition of the property as I go through my slideshow. But just to summarize the general location, so this is within the block bounded by Bishop, East Withrow, Talawanda Road. Campus is off here to the east. And if we look at the existing zoning classifications within the area, so everything identified as kind of this orange hue is the R3MS district. There is the MU or University District that's off to the east. It's more or less a holding zone for university-related uses. And a 2-family district is off to the west a block to the west off of Bishop. That's the R2MS district. So to begin with the timeline particular to this project overall. So as I mentioned, this is a 3-family district, and within the R3MS, you need a minimum of 60 feet of lot width and a minimum of 8,000 square feet in order to construct a new 3-family structure. The subject lot was exactly 60 feet wide and a little bit above 8,000 square feet, so it met the minimum requirements in order for a 3-family dwelling to be built by right. So a building permit was sought and issued for the new 3-family structure and the associated parking. So that was issued on July 14th of 2023. A demolition permit was issued thereafter on July 28th. And then the following year in 2024, so the dwelling itself was constructed. It passed its final building inspection April 30th. And on May 8th, there was a failed final zoning inspection. I have a copy of the letter that was distributed. There were essentially 3 issues identified in that letter, one of which was the parking not being completed according to the approved plans. The other 2 were rather minor in nature, just some wooden deck railing that needed to be painted and then some tree planting that needed to occur. So this inspection failed in part due to the rear parking area not being completed according to the approved plans. So we received a variance application from Mr. Webb July 26th, and that was assigned case number BZA 2024-03. And that got delayed a couple times. It's been kind of the common past practice or courtesy by former chairs of this board to offer relief to applicants when it's known that there's not going to be full attendance at a particular meeting, that there be an opportunity to request essentially an automatic postponement to the following meeting. It does do somewhat of a, you could argue, disservice to our applicants to delay indefinitely waiting for that full attendance, but nonetheless, that's what was encountered, so delayed August and September. Continuing on the 2024 dates, so eventually we were ready, and we were aware that we were going to have full participation, full attendance at the October 22nd hearing. The staff report, I believe, was issued the Thursday prior. And based on some of the content of that staff report, the request from the property owner at the time was, we need some additional time to digest some of the comments that were received, in particular from our fire chief and police chief. And so they had ultimately requested a tabling. We said, in our capacity as staff, we are in support of a tabling to give you an opportunity to air out those conversations with the chiefs, but ultimately, because full participation, full attendance was expected at that meeting, what was communicated at the time was the matter would actually need to appear on the agenda, it would need to be brought forward, and the board would actually need to make a motion in order to table the request another month. Another option was presented by my director, Mr. Perry, that the application could simply be withdrawn and resubmitted, and that was kind of a way around that whole process. And so that's exactly what Mr. Kakachis did. He decided to withdraw the application and resubmit it, and essentially just resubmitted exactly as it was under BZA 2024-03. So exact same request, exact same information, plans, etc. I didn't catch anything that was different in between those two. If I didn't, I apologize, but according to my recollection, that it's essentially the exact same application that was resubmitted. And then we had 2 more delays, and of course, we understand it's the holiday season, folks are busy, conflicts come up, and so we had to delay it 2 more times to await full participation. So now we've arrived, it's tonight's hearing. We've got 4 out of the 5 members, and the applicant wishes to proceed. They've indicated they're ready to have the matter heard. So here we are, we're hearing the matter tonight. Okay, so here is a drone view. We do have a drone pilot that is on staff here with the city in the service department. This is some imagery that was captured October 11th. So here you can see the new three-family dwelling that's been constructed, 417 and 419 East Withrow Street, and the parking that's associated with the dwelling located behind the building off of the public alley. So again, this block is bounded by, I believe that should not say University, I believe it's actually Bishop. But bounded by Church, Talawanda, Withrow, and Bishop. And then here's a drone view, October 11th. This is a look at the public alley looking west. So the subject property is over to the right-hand side. And then here's a site photo from August 19th. Another perspective from August 19th. And here's a site photo that was taken by our fire chief, Chief Deathridge, on September 10th. I believe this appears in his memo. So the relevant zoning provisions, again, it's in 1143-07C, and it provides the following coverage standards for developments in the R3 MS district. And it's separated into two categories. One category for lots that have vehicular access from a public street, and one for lots that have access from a rear or side alley with no access from a public street. So in this situation, because the alley is present and the access is off of the alley, we use the standards associated with that. And under this category, the maximum lot coverage is 45% of the lot. So here is a look at the previous condition. There was previously a single-family dwelling that sat on the site, so this is showing you what that looked like previously. You can see pre-existing grandfathered parking behind. And here was the approved building project for the three-family. So the plan that had been designed by Mr. Webb had shown this area here becoming seated and then retaining 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parking spaces, which meets the minimum by code. You need a minimum of 6 parking spaces for three-family use. And really the impetus behind seeding that area was to maintain compliance with that 45% coverage limit. The reason that that needed to be done, that this existing parking area could not be retained without entertaining a variance prior to the permit, was because the building footprint was being expanded. So as you can see the underlying aerial imagery, the original imagery, the original footprint of the single-family home was quite much smaller than the resulting footprint from the three-family. So it looks like it expanded a little bit northward as well as southward.
Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure.
Can I ask a question, Zach? May I ask a question?
Would you like me to? Yes, Mr. Chapman, go ahead.
So you're saying that when this plan was approved, a variance couldn't have been applied for at the time because, again, why?
A variance could have been sought if the desire was to keep the existing parking configuration, because that would have boosted the overall coverage percentage above 45%.
Which it still is as it stands now, correct?
So as it stands now, the sought percentage is 54.8%.
Right, but I mean, that parking space has not been vacated, it's still there.
It is still there,
Right.
yes. The photos show that there's still that double stack parking, 2 rows of parking, correct.
That's all.
So this is flipping between these slides here, so this just kind of helps stylize for you where those seated areas were to be located. Again, according to the submitted and approved plan. So a walkway leading to the public sidewalk along Withrow and 6 parking spaces off the alley. So the requested configuration, according to the plans that have been submitted, is to more or less retain the parking pad that was previously there. If I go back, again, previous condition, you can see the parking exists per the aerial imagery. Moving forward, this is the requested configuration. And then just revisiting a time series, so 2022, And then here's the status in 2023, and then finally 2024. One of the things that staff wanted to do in this particular case was to really study the existing lot coverage makeup on properties that are zoned R3MS. And the only reason that this is possible in an expeditious fashion is because the city now has a GIS layer that represents land cover. And this was obtained through a company called Ecopia AI, based in Canada, Toronto, Canada. What they were able to do is take existing aerial imagery that we provided them, and then they were able to vectorize all of the land cover features across, like, citywide. So we're talking about building footprints, sidewalks, parking pads, street pavement, swimming pools, sports fields. There's a number of different classifications. And by having all that data vectorized, it allows for quick calculation of square footages, and then in turn, calculation of percentages when you compare that to property boundaries. So what this graph represents, and I took this straight out of the ArcGIS software, looking at only those properties that are zoned R3MS. This is the distribution, the bell curve, if you will, of all properties, again, zoned R3MS, and their coverage percentages. So coverage percentages along the bottom, ranging from 0 up to 93%. And then along the y-axis here is a count.
Is
So
what again? What's the y-axis?
Count.
it's the count.
Okay.
Yes, so the higher the bar, the greater number of properties within the particular range. And the kind of lighter or darker blue, I suppose you could call this, this is for all the properties zoned R3MS, but then within those individual blocks is a category for parcels that are of a similar size to the one in question. And I ultimately just decided to pick a range from 8,000 to 10,000 square feet in size to offer a more direct comparison, apples to apples, between properties. So what it reveals when you actually look at the data, the average across all properties in the district is just a little bit below what the code maximum is of 45%. It's at 43.74%. If you look at the 80th percentile, which means all the properties, well, a way of stating it is, so when it comes to lots that are of similar size, 8,000 to 10,000 square feet, 80% of all properties within that size range have coverages that are 53.73% or less. And then stating it for all properties, not exclusive to those that are 8,000 to 10,000 square feet, the 80th percentile is 57.33%. So again, 80% of all properties zoned R3MS have coverages leading up to 57.33%. And here is what that looks like on a map. So here are all of the property boundaries identified as belonging to the R3MS district. And all of the similarly sized properties are in that exact shade of blue, this lighter blue color. And that includes the subject property, which is right here. So this shows you the distribution. So there's two pockets of R3MS zoning in town. There's the pocket that is in the northeastern quadrant of the mile square, we'll call it. And then there's a pocket in the southern quadrant, southern two quadrants, I should say, of the mile square. Here's Spring Street here, here's Campus Avenue, Talawanda Road, Sycamore Street. So turning to the decision criteria. So in accordance with section 1139.02C1, the burden of proof is upon the applicant to present reliable and substantial evidence that supports the request for variance. Furthermore, per section 1139.02C2, the BZA must find that practical difficulties exist that would render strict application of the code unreasonable. And in determining whether such difficulties exist, which are sufficient to warrant the variance, the board must use these 8 decision criteria, A through H. So beginning with criterion A, this is whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. Staff finds that criterion A does not support granting the variance. If the variance were denied, the property owner could continue to yield financial return from the new three-family dwelling which was recently constructed. The consequence for the owner would simply be a mandate to remove the back row of non-conforming off-street parking spaces from the property. By coming into compliance with the maximum lot coverage, the property would still be able to provide the minimum 6 off-street parking spaces required by the zoning code. Criterion B is whether the variance is substantial. We find that criterion B supports granting the variance because we find that the variance is not substantial. So within the past 5 years, the BZA has granted lot coverage variances of a similar magnitude for properties in the same zoning district, the R3MS, and that is per Appendix A of your staff report. And staff also performed a GIS analysis across all R3MS properties, as I illustrated, finding that 80% of all parcels sized between 8 and 10,000 square feet in size possess up to 53.73% coverage, with the remaining 20% possessing greater coverage. We feel that these findings indicate a serious need to evaluate the appropriateness of a 45% limit imposed on mile square residential properties. But until wide sweeping amendment is considered through the legislative process, that would be with Planning Commission and Council, the BZA has authority to consider variation on a case-by-case basis. It can further be noted the Planning Commission has recently openly discussed increasing allowable lot coverages in the mile square. And case in point, we have a text amendment package that is on its way to City Council that is proposing an allowable lot coverage of 80% for alley sites, those sites that front exclusively along alleys.
Question, when you say on its way to council,
Yes,
can you give us a timeline or?
next council meeting. Yep. Yeah, Planning Commission, they've already made a recommendation on it, so the text amendments are effectively prepared. They just need to go through the process. Criterion C, whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment as a result of the variance. We find that C supports the variance. The approval of a variance would enable a pre-existing amenity of the property to remain in place. And while the rear parking area is considered non-conforming due to 2 things. Number 1, the pavement straddles property lines, so there's a lack of 3-foot setbacks. And I'll actually mention that standard is being amended as a part of the alley text amendment package to allow for some flexibility. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the presence of more than one double stack space. And for the time being, that's the text amendments are not touching upon that. That is going to be left in place to have no more than one double stack space on any particular property. This, I suppose you could say, unusual or peculiar parking arrangement along this particular block has been a fixture of the area for decades. Furthermore, the removal of additional pavement could worsen violation activity, because if you remove the pavement, then vehicles may still attempt to park there. They're not supposed to. It's against ordinance. But nonetheless, folks may attempt to do it, and what that often results in are mud ruts in the grass. So for these reasons, we find criterion C supports the variance. Criterion D, this is a big one. Whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. So, as evidenced in the comments provided by the fire chief, the review of this variance has led to the discovery of apparent violations to Ohio Fire Code, or OFC. While the position of the northern edge of the parking pad meets the zoning setback, which is only 3 feet of distance, it seems the closer proximity of parking to the new structure has created an issue with respect to adequate egress and availability of space for placing ground ladders. The fire chief suggests the situation can be remedied by removing the back row of parking, as had been called for in the approved plans, as well as one space within the first row of parking that adjoins the alley to accommodate a walkway. The police chief has also expressed similar concerns. So while it is not the BZA's responsibility to administer, to interpret, to enforce the provisions of the Ohio Fire Code, the board may certainly take comments from public safety officials into account when rendering a decision on a zoning variance. However, it is the opinion of the community development staff that although the chief's comments identify important issues that should be adequately addressed moving forward, these particular issues do not directly relate to the consideration of extra covered surface on this subject lot. To this end, the approval of a variance may actually help to facilitate a solution that would best address everyone's concerns. Furthermore, in response to this discovered Ohio Fire Code compliance issue, we have begun a change in our practice and procedures. So the city has begun referring building permits for new residential construction to the fire chief for review moving forward. So that way, if there's issues of this nature that are caught earlier prior to the construction of the project, that those may be caught at that time rather than being caught as sort of a afterthought during consideration of a variance. Previously, only commercial permits were transmitted for fire review, so anything that was 4-family and above, so multifamily, anything that was commercial in nature automatically goes for fire review. But previously for residential, single-family, 2-family, 3-family, those applications were only going forward to engineering, zoning, and our building department. So that is a change in our practice to help prevent situations such as these from arising in the future. So D, we're going to rate that as mixed evidence.
Question,
Yes.
the current configuration, is that in violation of the fire code now?
I don't think I could testify to that. It would just be according to Chief Deathridge's memo.
So, but just let me understand that. So the discovery of the potential violation only occurred as a result of this application?
That's my understanding. I don't believe that this would have been caught had there not been an application sent to Chief Deathridge for review, for in-depth review, because he was not included on that initial building permit review, because fire typically wasn't included for residential. So this was only caught after the permit had been issued and the construction commenced and essentially finalized after passing of the final building inspection. Now, it is true that the project was not built according to the approved plan because the parking as it was still more or less remains. That aspect does not adhere to the approved plan, but in terms of the structure and so forth, that was built according to the approved plan. Criterion
So
E.
again, I'm just trying to understand, so the parking issue, the fire-related issue to the parking has been in violation since when?
It has apparently, as designed, well, I'm sorry, I take that back. So the permit that had been submitted had shown that seated area between the parking along the alley and the structure. By retaining the parking as it was previously and having that reviewed by the fire chief, that was when the fire chief made the discovery that there was the issue with respect to Ohio Fire Code.
I want to make an objection to the record at this point because the question was, or assumption that there's a violation, and there has been no citation. And
Right.
there will be evidence about other similar properties around for a long time, but I think there's also a question on interpretation of the Ohio Administrative Code, and we wholeheartedly disagree with what the fire chief has indicated. The primary access is along the street and not through the parking area. So to gain access to this property, you can approach it from the street. That's where the fire truck would most likely approach instead of through the alley where there's a parking area. The structure is also accessible on both sides, so there could be a fire response to the sides. The other part of it, Mr. Webb can get into this, according to the layout of the rooms, the windows are accessible from more than one fascia. So from the back, there's also a side access. There's no reason that they have to go by the cars to gain access for a ladder to
That's-
to
yeah,
get to the
If I
second.
say repeat for a
Right,
second,
yeah.
an objection is to note that you have an objection to the evidence,
Yeah.
Jack. You just did a speaking objection where you're going
Why
to.
do you make a record?
Jack, that's not the type of record we make here. You don't get to do a speaking objection with the very evidence you're gonna produce later. I think the body's smart enough to know that they're gonna hear evidence that that is the other side of that, and they weigh the evidence that they're gonna hear.
I didn't see in the board rules that I was not permitted to make a speaking objection.
Jack, you've been a lawyer long enough to know how that works. If you
Okay,
know, that's why
okay,
I
thank you,
Jack,
Mr. Kennard, thank you, Jack.
Come on, Jack.
The
So-
question was simply trying to ascertain whether any violation had been recorded prior to this application.
Prior to this variance
Yes.
application.
Right.
The only recording of information pertaining to alleged fire code violations was provided as a result of this application,
Okay.
so far as I am aware.
And Zach, just to be clear, that's because residential developments aren't sent to the fire chief for review.
Correct.
Right? And it's
Correct.
because it was sent to the fire chief for review as a result of the application.
But even if this
hence the-
application had been sent to the fire chief, it would have shown that there was a seated area between a row of 6 spaces and the
Right.
structure. So the fire code comments, or the fire comments, I'll say more generally, may have been different than those that appear now in light of the property owner wishing to retain the previous configuration.
Mr. Conrad.
Understood.
So for purposes of procedure, I would recommend, Mr. Board Chair, that you take the objection under advisement, and the court will, the jury, BZA then will consider the evidence as presented.
So according to our attorney, we'll take the objection under advisement and consider it at the appropriate time.
Okay, I think we're on letter E. This is whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. We find that criterion A does not lend support toward granting the variance. Subject property has been in the same ownership for decades. During an on-site visit on August 19th, a representative of the owner revealed that they were not initially aware that the architect's site plan would result in the elimination of half the existing off-street parking spaces. Had the owner become aware of this potential loss in parking earlier, perhaps a decision on a coverage variance could have been rendered by the BZA prior to the redevelopment of this lot. Criterion F is whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. and our rating on this one is mixed evidence. So the predicament at hand is that a pre-existing number of off-street parking spaces cannot feasibly continue while also complying with the zoning code stipulation for maximum overall coverage. Ultimately, the board must decide which characteristic should preside or dominate over the other. In other words, additional off-street parking above and beyond the code minimum, again, 6, it's only 6 that are required. This would not be possible to implement on the site without approval of the variance to allow for that increase in coverage. The code does not confer a guaranteed right to provide parking in excess of minimums. Should the variance be denied, tenants with cars would likely need to locate other long-term parking accommodations in town. They could resort to utilizing on-street parking. And I believe there's been a number of emails and letters submitted by tenants that have been entered into the record. Criterion G is whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. We find that G supports the variance. The general policy intent behind lot coverage standards is to help preserve green space, prevent overdevelopment, and help facilitate stormwater infiltration as opposed to exacerbating stormwater runoff. Even with approval of the variance, a significant degree of the lot would still remain devoted to green space. It'd be a little over 4,000 square feet of green space, amounting to approximately 45% of the lot. And this would not meet the letter of the law, but it could still serve its general intents and purposes. Additionally, a well-utilized, albeit non-conforming because of the double-stacked nature of the spaces, a well-utilized feature of the property would be permitted to remain and thus continue to relieve the parking demand pressures on nearby public streets. Lastly, criterion H, any other relevant factor. We find that H supports granting the variance. There's some additional factors to consider related to the Oxford Tomorrow Comprehensive Plan. I'm sure Mr. Grove will be pleased to hear that.
Yes, I brought it with me.
With some relevance to the case at hand, there's some objectives. So objective L3, to promote development and redevelopment in targeted areas. Objective H4, to maintain an adequate capacity of student housing. Objective M4, to ensure parking facilities in the mile square are adequate and effective in meeting demand. And objective C4, to provide high-quality, coordinated public safety services. So being less than a block away from the edge of campus, we feel this project at 417 and 419 East Withrow exemplifies positive contributions toward the first two objectives, L3 and H4. However, it appears in this case the interests of objectives M4 and C4, again, those being ensuring parking facilities are adequate and to provide high-quality public safety services. The chiefs had concerns regarding public safety. That the interests of these objectives appear to be in competition with one another in this case. So that concludes the criteria. And I did go ahead and grab, this is the latest exhibit from the applicant. This is a schematic of the parking configuration. So if we need to refer back to this during our hearing, we can certainly do so. But just to clarify, so in your packet, this was the configuration that was presented. This is the one that was previously shared with me through email. So again, flipping back and forth, this was the previous, and this is the current parking configuration. So this is essentially showing how those double-stacked spaces along the alleyway on this block, how they're assigned out to the particular properties that stretch along that block. And that concludes my report. I'm happy to take any additional questions from the board.
Any questions at this time for Mr. Moore?
May I clarify a couple of
Yes.
points here? So as it relates to the chart that you showed with reflecting the 80th percentile, if I understand that correctly, are you saying that 80% of the lots between 8,000 and 10,000 square feet exceed the maximum lot coverage right now?
If I could return to the slide that shows the graph. So, if you consider these bars here, that these are counts of properties. So the higher the bar is, the greater the count of properties. And the coverages, it's arranged on a spectrum from 0 to 93. So 45, the district maximum is right here. So everything past that line exceeds the district maximum.
But the way that's written, that would suggest to me that that's 80% of the lots.
Well, 80% of the lots have up to
Up to, okay.
Correct.
coverage.
So these lines are denoting 80%. So 80% of the overall graph is at this line or to the left of it. And then 80% of the parcels that are in a similar size category to the one in question, which are subsets of the overall bar, 80% of just that color is to the left of this red line. Does that make sense?
I'm so confused.
So Zach,
I understand.
measures.
45%.
Yeah,
Right.
measures of central tendency have never wowed me as ways to describe distribution, so I know you have the average up there.
Yes.
And since you don't have the standard deviation, what's the median?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Well, to me, it looks like it's gonna be above 43.
Yeah.
So 50% of those lots that you have in that graph are probably closer to the 45, maybe even a little bit more.
Slightly, yeah.
Something like that.
Yes?
Whatever that middle value happens to be,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just eyeballing the curve looks to be probably closer to 50%. Steve?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Put up here.
yeah, okay.
That's the only question I have.
Any other questions for Zach?
Criterion A, if we can go back that far. I believe you said if the variance was denied, the owner would remove the back 3 spots. I'm just curious, is that a, like an opinion or an assumption? Why not remove a front row, right? If you're just trying to get down to 6 spots, why do we know it would be the back row that would be removed? Perhaps I misheard, but.
So in my evaluation, if the variance is denied, then we must apply the code, the standard code, which
Right.
is the 45%. So it would more or less have to revert to what the approved plan had shown, because the approved plan had demonstrated compliance with the 45%. And if I recall correctly, it's pretty much right up to that limit of 45. And the way that that was accommodated was by removing that parking in between the first row and the building.
So it's not so much the top row of 6 and the bottom row of 6, but is it an entirety of 6 spots that would need to be removed, or is it a portion of that?
Well, it probably wouldn't make sense to remove the first row because the vehicles have to be able to pull into those spaces.
Right,
So naturally,
you would
the
remove
conclusion
the
is
back
it
row.
has to be the back row.
Okay. Just want to make sure I heard that right, not the opposite of that.
Yeah.
I see.
And back from the perspective of the alley.
Right.
Is what he's, right.
Back, not the back of the structure.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So when was it discovered that the current configuration of parking was not according to what the original submission was?
Final zoning inspection is a letter dated May 8th, and it notes, it has this may need to be entered into the record. I don't believe this was included in the packet. It's mentioned in the staff report, but this is a graphic that was included on the letter, and it identifies, so this is a snapshot of the approved plan that had been submitted by Mr. Webb and approved by the city, that showed where the parking area was to be situated and showing that that back row was to be seated. That's the note on here. So number 2 on this letter identifies rear parking area needs to be completed in accordance with the approved site plan. See image at right.
Date?
May 8th, 2024 is the date of the letter. And this was our code enforcement officer went out on May 8th and took photos of the condition. So that's how we were able to discern the condition.
And that went to the property owner
Yeah, it's addressed to Mr. Tom Kakachis.
in May of 2024. And subsequent occurrences or anything, any result as a result of that letter? This is the result.
Yeah, if I could return to the slides for
Because
just a
it's been
moment.
delayed. Gotcha.
I'll go back to the timeline. So the variance application was received July 26th as a follow-up to the May 8th inspection.
Gotcha. Steve?
On criterion B, you're asking us to make a finding. We make the findings, by the way. You're asking us to make findings that the variance is not substantial. Are you basing this upon just the fact that you've compared this particular applicant with other properties in this zoning district? Or are you actually looking at the code and deciding that, or telling us, we should amend the code de facto because these other properties are doing it, or you have some other basis for that? I was unclear about that. Why it's not substantial.
So I think the analysis is twofold. So number 1, it's looking to past precedent in terms of what this board has granted in terms of percentage, lot coverage percentage, and that's presented in Appendix A. So just to highlight those cases for you, and I went back within a 5-year period. I didn't go all the way to the beginning of time. I just went back a reasonable amount of time and uncovered 5 individual cases. And actually, 2 of the 5 were the same zoning district, R3MS, and then the other 3 were R2MS, the 2-family district. So 10 and 12 North Elm Street, a porch addition was granted, and that was coverage of 52%. 211 South Beach Street, 66.13% was granted. That was for a church parking area, and that was one where there was work without a permit in that particular scenario. 407 North Campus Avenue was R3MS. 55.2% was granted for that one. 650 South Campus Avenue, 50.4%, Zone R2MS granted. 114 West Collins, for a 2-family conversion, denied 83.3% for that one. So that was the first fold of the 2 folds, is looking to what this board has deemed acceptable, what they have granted as past variances percentage-wise. Of course, there's other factors to consider, but in terms of the numerical percentage, that's the comparison. And then the other aspect to this is, as oftentimes enters these discussions, is kind of the legislative realm. I know that's not the job of the BZA, is to think about what future legislation could be, but I think it's reasonable to insert some evidence here regarding current ongoing conversations with the Planning Commission regarding coverage. And previously, the city staff, we did not have this land cover data set at our disposal where we could do this sort of in-depth analysis in such an expeditious way. It would have taken measuring each and every individual property's coverage, which would be it's almost insurmountable, inhuman task. Suppose you could assign it to an intern if you wanted to. It'd be rather cool. But now that we have this data set, we are empowered to make data-driven decisions, and we now know what the actual coverage makeup percentage-wise is in these zoned areas. And so we can make even more informed decisions, whether it's in a quasi-judicial capacity or a legislative one. So that would be how I would further explain criterion B and why I find it's supportive of the variance at this time.
So along with your conclusion that there's substantial evidence to support the variance, you go on to say, to ensure public safety, the board may approve the variance request on condition that an appropriate solution to fire code issues is reached to the satisfaction of the fire chief. Can you elaborate on what that would look like, how that would unfold?
I might actually turn to our law director for an opinion on that. Do you believe that that is acceptable practice? I know that the bylaws allow for approvals with conditions. Do you believe there's a rational connection there in that the public safety issues can be considered by the board in their granting or denial of a variance?
I think that the answer needs to wait until we hear from the applicant, because they need to address some aspect of that, and I anticipate that they will.
Yeah, I anticipate that they're gonna argue that the fire code issue doesn't apply.
Or that there's other means to get the safety equipment where it needs to be.
And why hasn't that been discussed with the fire chief? But we'll find that out.
Criterion D.
Yeah.
Is the property otherwise zoning compliant as is?
In terms of use, yes.
So this parking slash seating variance is the only thing that's keeping this property, as of today, from being zoning compliant.
I will admit I haven't had follow-up on the other two items that are addressed in my zoning inspection letter, but those could easily be followed up on, and I don't anticipate that those would be difficult to show that you're adhering to those,
Got it.
that the property owner could fulfill those.
Got it.
And the property is currently occupied? Or, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that's.
Yes.
According to all the emails.
Right.
And the parking configuration
it was in the link.
previously the configuration used on the property, correct?
So as I understand it, there's actually 14 spaces
Okay.
on the property previously. If I go back to the slide, and I'll go to the 2022 aerial. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the back row, and then another 7 in the front. So actually 14 spaces. And then going by the plan that was submitted with the variance application, it shows 6 and 6. So 12.
So if there had not been a lapse in use, you would have considered that a pre-existing non-conformance.
It's presumed legal nonconforming.
Any other questions for Zach for now? Thank you.
Thank you.
For the applicant?
So you don't need to swear me in, we're done with that.
We already swore you in.
You've been sworn in.
Ready to go.
That's usually
You know
the,
the drill.
You've been
no,
sworn
but
in.
that's the lag while he gets
You are sworn.
presentation up there. so.
Okay, it should be there. There we go.
All right. Good evening, members of the board. It's been an hour talking about this parking so far. Hopefully, I'm not going to turn it into two. I think it's not a very complicated issue personally. Start with this front picture just to talk just briefly about code compliance as was asked up here. One of our concerns of the fire chief that's been expressed at this body and many others is that entrance should have, every building should have all their entrances facing the street, so it's easy for them to find the address if there's an emergency. This building was designed specifically to meet that requirement. It's a three-family with three very distinct front doors. As was pointed out, the fire can simply be fought from the street. We don't have the luxury of fighting fires from four sides very many places in the mile square. It's only if this back lot isn't developed, it's only if the alley in fact is developed. We have lots of undeveloped alleys out there too. So lots of fires, we only fight from the front and the side. But this has been drawn in compliance with current code in terms of fire safety, in terms of visibility, accessibility, and just recognizable entrances for safety in particular. There we go. So, as was kind of pointed out, this east-west alley has historically been what we would call kind of a pocket parking area. It's actually the ideal arrangement that our planning commission and city council will be considering. It's gonna be, I believe, considered in the rewrite, the form-based zoning code. This serves lots of purposes. There's no driveway to the front, which would cost us more on-street parking. It's visually hidden from all sides. It is the place where cars simply belong for residents of this district. And as Zach put in his thing there, these parking spaces are dedicated. This is not a Kroger parking lot. It's not first come, first served. They're absolutely dedicated. And one other thing I wanted to clear up here when we talk about stacking spaces being in violation, the clarification is that we are allowed one stacking space to count. It's not that you can't have 6 stacking spaces. Only one of them may count towards your required parking. So if my lot was a little narrower and I was required to have 6 spaces, I could have 5 in a row and 1 double stack, and that would be allowed. I can exceed that, which is what we're doing here, by paving the rest of it, but I can't count those. Those don't count toward my required parking spaces. So just a clarification, double stack parking is allowed. It's allowed to count even toward meeting your zoning requirement. It is allowed generally throughout the city. So there's not a violation by its configuration, as we'll say here. As I said, this parking, it predates the development, as Zach pointed out. You can see that it's been there when there was a single-family house there. It's gone all the way through all these generations. Oh, and also, it happens across the alley too. What you kind of see on the bottom right slide is the back of the fraternity. The fraternity on the south side of that block does the same thing. So parking is all over, buried in the center of this alley, kind of by design. So the proposed development would continue this, and the reality of what we would be asking to do here tonight, were this variance to fail, would be to simply cut out this parking. So this pocket parking that serves both sides of the alley, serves all these residences in assigned spaces, would simply be cutting a piece of it away. The purpose being solely to meet the letter of the law, which evidence shows is awarded variances multiple times for lots of good reasons, and is currently considered too low of number for actual development. So we expect as the new zoning code makes its way through planning commission, that lot coverages are gonna be raising. As Zach pointed out, they're looking at it even ahead of the new zoning code with the end of the moratorium on the alley development, raising alley developments up to 80%. The prevailing opinion, so to speak, of the zoning code is that as we look for density, as we look for ways to try to find places for students, our land is really underutilized in a lot of these areas. 45% is a pretty large number. That would not be a uncommon number for, Southern Knolls or some other areas, but in a more densely, more urban, sidewalked, limited parking sort of neighborhoods, 45 is a very restrictive lot coverage. So the only reason we would be cutting these things up would be to meet the parking requirement as it currently stands now, anticipating that, you know, in a year, we could probably put them back because the parking is, lot coverage is likely gonna go up. So the idea of, you know, kind of what public good is really served here by creating a missing tooth in this group of parking here across the back. So public safety is a concern here. So the fire chief expressed this. I would say that while we're talking about this new code being written and all these changes, I would suggest that the fire chief needs to be at those meetings when the code is written, because our code is currently written specifically to say that we are allowed to have parking and sidewalks and driveways within 3 feet of any building in the entire city. That's not mile square limited. That's part of our supplemental regulations chapter, in the parking chapter rather. It applies citywide. It might apply to your house. Your driveway might be very close to your house as well. 3 feet is the minimum that the code currently requires. We're currently providing over 7 feet. And just to be clear, our variance request tonight is not about the adjacency of the parking or the nearness of the parking to the building. Our variance tonight is about lot coverage, solely lot coverage. Changing the lot coverage does not create a new variance of a required separation distance from the parking to the building. That's been well established. So in our opinion, the fire chief's issue should be with the code itself and not coming in late to the game on one particular case and deciding that it's not appropriate. To that end, and a couple things were said here tonight, that the fire code says that we can't do this, and that, oh, well, we didn't find this because we don't review residential. The fire chief doesn't review residential. The implication being he reviews commercial. Certainly plan developments, things like that make their way through planning commission. They get routed to the fire chief. Here's some perfect examples of big commercial properties, residential and mixed use, where parking is directly adjacent to the building. All of these are relatively new construction. The top one is the Verge right there. That was a planned development. That was reviewed by the fire chief, and that's commercial. And the fire code existed at that time, and it wasn't an issue. Gaslight is kind of shown there on the bottom right. Similar situation, also a planned development, went through layers and layers of approvals, layers and layers of being routed through every department of the city, and the result is something like this, where the sidewalks are literally just a bush away from the building, and the parking is certainly within the 7 feet that we're looking for today. With regard to egress, we kind of made the point that egress windows are requirements. Egress from a building code perspective, both commercial and residential code, requires 5 feet. You have to be able to walk out a door has to be able to swing out. That's a 3 foot long thing. You have to have a 5 foot by 5 foot area to get out of the building. That's what the building code requires in both residential and commercial. Now, that could mean you could step on the driveway. I mean, from a code standpoint, you're allowed to count the driveway as outside the building and out of the building, out of harm's way. So perhaps our code needs to be looked at differently by the fire chief, or we need to reconcile this, because it's not just about residential development. It really relates to absolutely everything that's been built in the city at this point. So, again, so what we're talking about tonight is not safety necessarily, specifically, certainly not distance from the parking to the back of the building. We're talking about lot coverage, and we really appreciate the new data availability that the city has to look at this more specifically. But even before that, as Zach pointed out, this is a little excerpt from the staff report in your packet, how many times this board has voted 5-0 to approve these. Just so happens a couple of these are my projects, and so I had access to the site plan to put up here for you. And I want to point out that, once again, not only are we talking about lot coverage in excess, the variance that we're here for tonight, in all of these cases, the parking is code compliant adjacent to the building. So some commercial, some residential, they've all made their way through here. It's in our code to allow it. So that's really where we are. So decision standards, I think that staff did a pretty nice job on the decision standards overall. We agree that number 2 is particularly important, that we don't feel that the variance is substantial. And we also feel that the essential character of the neighborhood would be maintained as opposed to being compromised. To cut parking out would significantly change the neighborhood more so than the construction of the residence did, in our opinion. So we believe those 2 decision standards are in our favor. Obviously, we have the decision standards from the land use goals of the comp plan that Zach did a nice job pointing out for us as well. And we believe that the spirit and intent of the zoning code is upheld here, specifically because the zoning code has broad goals in mind. Yes, we have very specific math that we have to do, but we have broad goals in mind. And what's happening in this particular block is in line with our broad goals of, let's bury our parking in the back, let's have it accessed from the alley instead of from the street. Let's not cut our mile square streets up with a driveway every 6 feet, so we can't park there anymore. So we feel like the goal here would be to maintain the broader goals of the planning commission and our zoning code, less so the specific 45%. And so that's sort of why we feel that we agree with staff that we meet the decision standards and would appreciate your consideration.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Webb?
I have a question. Mr. Webb, were you the architect in this project from its beginning?
Yes.
Did you design the plan that was submitted to the building department to obtain the building permit?
Yes.
It included, as we've been advised, the elimination of those 6 parking spaces in the back, correct?
That's correct.
And did you advise the owner of the property that was a requirement of the building permit?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I need. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Mr.
I think so.
I have 2 hypothetical questions, if that's okay. Which is, there's 2 scenarios that it's possible, right? One is you wait a month, and then the new code is 80%. Then
That's
this
not-
is
that's
whatever.
not, that doesn't apply directly. That was more of I think Zach intended that more of as a descriptor of the direction that we're going.
So direction it was going, it could be 60, whatever number it could be, right? That's one scenario. The other scenario is we don't grant the variance, you go and rip out 7 parking spots, turn it into what, turf?
Yep.
And it's conceivable to me that students will continue to park on turf regardless,
Right.
or on the street. And if they park on the street, they could park next to a fire hydrant, they could park on top of each other, they could park in the front yard.
Yes.
Students are unpredictable beings.
I think we could.
This is
I think we could
true.
predict they'll park in the grass there.
Yeah, as they have been, because this parking lot has been there for many, many years. That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you.
Jack, you want to talk to?
Yeah, I just-
I was going to say during the public hearing portion of this.
Yeah, I
Okay.
forwarded photo display to Zach, and
Mr. Chairman,
these are just photos around town of parking
I don't think he's been sworn in.
Oh.
for the board to consider, where
Excuse me, have you been sworn in? Did you swear?
I'm not a witness.
He's not a witness, he's a lawyer engaged in advocacy.
Okay.
Shouldn't we take the evidence first and at the end hear arguments?
Well, I mean, that's really up to you.
I'm only asking that he
Because-
display the photo display to you of the properties around town. That's all I was up here to ask. I forwarded the photos, he's seen them, and just show them to the board. Some of them.
Photos of the cases that Zach has already
Just,
submitted to us?
various properties, going way beyond the cases.
I don't think they're relevant.
Mr.
Have we been
I
provided
guess
those? or-
we haven't seen these photos.
We have not seen those?
No, they were not part of the original presentation. Some of them, you saw the Verge, which Scott had in his, and a couple of others.
Well, do
And
we
I
need
think
to
on
see-
comparison, it's helpful to note that the Verge is 3-story, where this property is only 2-story, making it more accessible from the fire safety standpoint.
Mr. Carroll, would it be acceptable to see the pictures of the cases that Zach has already identified, that we already know?
You know,
Or-
administrative hearings are typically relatively loose as it comes to evidentiary standards. I think the intention is, because most of the time applicants don't have counsel, and you want to give them an opportunity to fairly present their case. As the board chair, you have control over that process. But in my experience and in my view, I think that the administrative body is better off erring on the side of introduction of evidence rather than excluding it, and then you can make a determination on weight of the evidence relative to your ultimate decision and deliberation.
Yeah, I think at least, if you can you post on the screen, at least the properties that Zach has identified as previous.
I don't have that information available or organized in that fashion.
Oh, I'm not sure what do you have then?
As I explained, there are photos around town of other properties where parking is permitted right against the building. And they're not in violation.
Is that necessarily value added? I mean, I think we
Yeah,
all
that's
can,
not-
we can all think of examples around town,
Yeah,
I'm
of
sure of
course.
that. I'm not sure that it's.
I'm just making the
districts.
record, and if
Yeah,
you
sure.
decide
Yeah.
not to take it, then I want to proffer it into the record, so it's there for subsequent review.
That's fine.
And you
Sure.
can decide whether to receive it.
All right, so what does that mean from your perspective?
We'll view it, or,
No,
My recommendation, I would suggest you view it, because
Sure.
just
Yeah.
as a cleaner process.
because he's gonna put it in the record anyway.
yeah.
So, show us your
Pictures.
photos.
Go ahead.
And I have
Zach.
those
Zach, yes.
on the laptop, and here they are.
Waste of time.
No cat pictures?
Nice.
All
There we
angles.
go.
Isn't this already been produced?
Yeah, this is- I don't see what.
I think we've seen this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
This is a ladder showing that the second story is accessible, even though the vehicle's there. Scott, these are the approved plans, right? Okay. You show egress and access.
Okay. Just the two PDFs, and then there's 5 images.
And just to confirm, though, the variance is about coverage, not whether or regard parking is close to the building or, it's already 7 feet apart, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so some of the pictures were beside the point.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I think the point is that all those other properties would be in violation if you were looking at the strict letter of the fire chief's interpretation. And they are not.
Yeah.
Because there's other access. And if there's primary access through the front of the street, you don't have to go through the alley. Oh, it doesn't make sense. You saw the fire truck. You're not gonna feed that through the parking lot in the alley. You're gonna approach it from the street. And it's typically the way you would approach. Mr. Webb indicated that the building is designed so the front doors face the street, and that's for easier primary access. The floor plan would show that the upstairs bedrooms all have windows on more than one exposure. So you don't need to go to the back because you could go to the side, which is actually more proximate to the front of the street. The property owner is very concerned about safety, and we wouldn't want to build an unsafe structure. You have it's been submitted, I don't know that you've seen them, multiple letters from the residents, all indicating their preference to keep the parking configuration as it is. They stress safety from another standpoint, many of them being girls, coming home late at night because they have jobs. They don't want to have to search for a parking place around town. They don't want to have to walk at a distance. They feel that it's unsafe. So the current configuration really promotes safety of the occupants who are there. They say that they don't have a problem with configuration. They're roommates, they're dedicated parking, so there's not a problem. Just speaking briefly to the police chief's reservation, he said there could be a problem, which is, in my mind, objectionable. It's conjectural. There hasn't been a problem, even though the same use has been in existence for a long, long time. I commented to the client that if I look at what the police chief had to say, that's like saying, we're not going to have any more retail establishments because there have been shopliftings at Kroger's. The fact that there could be a problem isn't a valid basis to deny the variance. And to me, it's really pretty simple, only because the volume of like-kind properties have enjoyed variances that are similar to this. You look at the neighborhood, the alley configuration. I know the Planning Commission has really shifted direction in the last 30-some years on how parking will be handled. There's a preference now for alley access and parking off the alley instead of using the street. And I've had other cases involving that, and it's a clear trend. So even the kind of housing stock that we have here, if any of these neighborhoods were exclusionary single-family, the land use plan calls for higher density. And so it's been upzoned to allow two-family, and then upzoned again to allow three-family. And the necessity for parking comes along with added density. The land use plan talks about a walkable community, and I think from an idealistic standpoint, we think of a nice spring day and walking around town, and sure, that sounds good. But when I think of a cold winter night, even like when I went to the parking meter tonight, I had to walk around quite a distance because of the ice and snow. I didn't want to fall down. I think of people having to walk a distance after midnight in the cold weather. Sure, I understand why someone who lives in that house, and it's a very nice house, would prefer to have parking that's immediately accessible. And if they're girls, from a safety standpoint, all more the reason. So I think this is a very practical application. Property owner is conscientious. It's a major improvement to the area. And, new housing has improved safety from the standpoint of wiring and other features also. That's what I wanted to share.
Right, and I would just add that from a public safety standpoint, there are extenuating circumstances. There could be a proximity to a fire hydrant being closer to the alleyway, even though it's preferred to enter from the front of the street, the doors facing the street and all that, but public safety has to consider other situations they may run into with access. So perhaps, and this is just conjecture, but perhaps proximity to a fire hydrant or easier access with other obstructions could prohibit access from the street.
Well, and to that point, the obstructions in the back are primarily dumpsters that are blocking the alleyway at times.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that that's a significant impediment. Sure, from a fire safety standpoint, all kinds of things, especially if you had a mass event in an area. And we don't like to think of that, but it's conceivable.
Sure.
But to the point, this has been permitted all around town. There is no violation. They haven't been cited. And I would think that if he thought that there was a real public safety concern, that he would be right on top of it and saying this needs to be corrected. As opposed, and he's not here tonight. I mean, you know, he knew that there was a hearing, so if he was really concerned, I would expect him to be here to be a witness and explain himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grove. Well, for me, this is a lot coverage case. What the wrench in is the issue of the fire code and a potential public safety. But I also want to have some sense of practicality. And I'd like to hear from both the applicant and the city on this, whether it's Mr. Perry or Zach. And that is Zach's conclusion recommendation to grant the variance on the condition that the fire chief's issues can be resolved. So for me, that's an issue of practicality. So can we figure out? Yeah.
So can I layer this in procedurally?
Yep.
I would still consider this the open hearing part.
Right.
And then, just a procedural issue then with Mr. That Mr. Grove might need to address because the supplemental documents that came in on Thursday, Friday, and yesterday, and how that's gonna be handled. We have to get some response from the applicant on the record for that. And then I would say that it would be appropriate to close the public hearing. And then we begin the deliberation. I'm gonna make a recommendation that the body enter into executive session because of pending and threatened litigation. And that would have to be done by some motion second. And roll call.
Ohio Rise
What's the
Code
pending
120.
litigation? Are they-
Well, I mean, that's what might get discussed in executive session, Ohio Revised Code 121.22.
For legal matters.
It's one of the reasons that the body can go into executive session. But just to clarify, so I can get a response from both the city and the applicant about the practicality of the conclusion recommendation about the variance being granted and conditioned on satisfactory resolution.
Appropriateness of whether or not conditions should be considered.
So how about the city first, since Sam or Zach?
Well, I suppose I could start by saying, I think with respect to the conclusion here, approving the variance request on condition that an appropriate solution to fire code issues is reached to the satisfaction of the fire chief. I think that starts with talking to the fire chief. I don't think there's been any evidence thus far that there's been any outreach of any kind in response to the comments received. Not to mention that was the original justification for why this was delayed in October, was to reach out to the chiefs, talk things through, see if a solution could be reached, mutually between parties. I can't really speak to the practicality until those conversations commence. I don't think I have anything further to offer the board at this time.
Sam, anything else to offer? Mr. Kennard?
Was, Sam, you weren't, I don't think you put under oath.
No, I have not been. Do I need to do that to shake my head? I have not. I'll swear that I'll tell the truth. And no, I don't have anything further to say.
Mr. Webb?
Yeah, so,
Understand
Would wanna know
exactly how they would, you know,
Yeah.
what we're doing
Yeah.
if that is the decision.
Sure.
yeah, so at this point, I mean, without a violation, without a specific requirement described how we are potentially in violation, or, you know, his comments are very general in nature here. I feel like the condition that you're suggesting is also fairly ambiguous to say, you know, I mean, it's simply a question of, can we put the parking in the way the code would allow us to in terms of proximity or not? If there is a fire code thing, I think it would require a broader discussion citywide than specific to our case.
Mr. Knapp?
Talking about practicality, I don't know what you call the things, curb blocks. I mean, they're standard parking lots that prevent a car from going up too far. I mean, I don't know if that's a practical solution or not, but one that strikes me as a logical discussion point.
Mr. Webb?
Well, I believe that the practical solution here is that paving adjacent to buildings has really not typically been considered a problem for the fire code or the fire chief in particular. I mean, in fact, you know, fire lanes are a thing where you are actually required to put paving right up against the building to make sure that the fire truck can get there. So the question of whether or not there could be paving near the building or parking near the building, we just simply think the fire chief is perhaps misinterpreting the code or something, and the lack of specificity kind of bears that out, that, you know, if he would simply say, fire code says you must be 15 feet away, we would have a discussion here tonight, but that's not what has been said here. And the evidence throughout the city and through other aspects of building and fire codes would show that you can fight a fire off of paving, you can fight fires from parking lots. I mean, that's really not, I don't think we prohibit, or the fire code believes you can't fight a fire from a parking lot.
I understand and I appreciate your.
Well, it's just a
your
practical
position.
interpretation.
But
you're
in
asking
terms of
for.
practicality, would tire blocks create an impracticality?
As long as the tire blocks would allow us to maintain the parking that we have. If he's gonna say that the tire blocks need to be 30 feet from the building, I have a problem with that.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Which is to say, you just said right now that the fire chief's comments were very vague, and did you make any attempt to clarify with the fire chief? Hey, what did you mean? How can we address your concerns?
No, we did not. I mean, I felt like we were kind of standing on the point that we made, that his issue is really not with this particular project. I mean, it is a broader issue citywide, and, you know, as long as we're meeting the zoning code, you know, the alternative to talking to the fire chief would be to give him what he asked for, would be not only to remove the 6 parking spaces we're asking for tonight, he wants us to take away one of them that we're required to have. He asked for taking another one away to create a passageway through there. We just feel it's excessive, it's not practical, and it's not supported by the
email, I
fire
think,
code.
right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Approve the lot coverage. Sure. But we could approve the lot coverage
Yes.
variance, and the condition would be then something like, tire blocks.
Well, like I
Is
said,
that practical?
I mean,
Is that a
it's hard to us, it's hard, curb stop.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you see in most parking lots, Kroger's has them.
If that doesn't affect our lot coverage, I mean, if, you know, you're asking me to ask,
Understand.
to, you know, well, are we willing to just give the fire chief whatever he asks for? That's not a practical solution. So.
I gave you
So-
I mapped out a solution.
If his concern is that we're not only just parking in these new 6 parking places, we're running into the back of the building, parking bumpers, parking blocks would be a practical solution for that. I don't think that's his concern, that they're parking beyond the parking lot. His concern was the parking we're asking for.
Sam?
Thank you. I
Yes.
think we can just simply revise the condition to require parking blocks,
That's agreeable.
and then this will be done.
That's pretty much where I was gonna go.
Yeah.
In terms of approving the lot, I mean, my personal position would have been to approve the lot coverage variance with the condition that parking blocks be positioned, according to the prescribed code, to ensure that parked cars don't get up on top of it.
And I don't know if you want to call Mr. Kakachis up to say that, or if Scott Webb can say that they're okay with it, or.
Mr. Webb?
Yes, parking blocks to prohibit the cars from parking beyond the parking we are requesting this evening is a solution we would gladly accept.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Kennard, before we close this, are we still gonna need to go into
We
executive?
have the one issue, because there were submissions of the files and a request to supplement the record. I would note that the BZA rules require the submission of documents to go into the back of the week before they are published. These were past that deadline, but because the applicant is asked to include them, I need to get some indication from the applicant what you intend to do with that. I would add, I kind of went through them. There were letters of support, apparently, for the students who live in the building. It was duplication of, I think, much of the evidence that's already been presented related to the 5 properties and some BZA meeting minutes. I'm not sure that it adds anything, but if you want to include it into the record, that's gonna lead the BZA to say they might have to consider it, because if they don't consider it, there's an issue later if there's a 2506 appeal. So I need to know whether or not the applicant wants to have the record supplemented. If it doesn't, then we can proceed immediately to close the record and go to deliberation.
Well, Chris, it sounds like with the curb stops.
I can't presume what they're going to do. All I'm focused on is.
I don't think the inclusion of the evidence hurts anything.
The problem is that the body has an obligation to review the information. They haven't had time to do it. If you ask to include it, I think.
That's something we're gonna discuss in executive session if we go
They
there.
have.
If we go there.
Tabling this hearing in order to review that extra information. Because if they let it in, they've gotta review it if you request them to do it. So if you wanna move forward based upon the evidence presented, then they can get the deliberations today.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think we can move forward.
Thank you. Scott, if you want to tell the record, please, that you're not asking to supplement the record with information.
Okay.
Worthless anyway.
So based on the discussion, we are not looking to supplement the record and extend this hearing at this time.
Thank you.
And then the one other housekeeping item, there's 2, we'll deal with the objection later, but we are going to supplement the record with the staff letter from May 2024, I believe. And we'll identify that as staff exhibit A for purposes of the record.
Staff Exhibit A.
Any objection, Jen?
No, as part of the procedural history.
Okay, so I think that you can close the record, and when we come back and you can talk about the objection, we'll chat about that.
Okay. Any other? Then I'll take a motion to close the deliberative portion of the hearing.
So moved.
I'll second it.
Evidentiary-
I'm
To
sorry,
close
The evidence-
public session.
Move to deliberation.
So moved.
Second. All right. Okay, so we are now where we are. Again, personally, and before we take a vote,
Well, do we need to go to the executive session?
No.
no, he's saying,
I think it wouldn't hurt.
okay,
I'll move that we do that then.
okay.
And you
I
say
need
it's
a
for-
motion that under Ohio Revised Code 121.22, Section F, the discussion with the attorney about impending litigation.
Okay, I'll move. I'll move.
That's so moved by,
Second.
second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Actually, we need a roll call
Roll
vote.
call vote.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Des George,
Yes.
Mr. Cheffin,
Yes.
Mr. Russo.
Yes. Okay, we now are in executive session.
We're going back into the.
We'll go back into
Well,
Or if you-
gotta turn off the video.
What was that in?
That room is locked. That room is locked back there.
Does Chris know the code? Do you want to, you can go assist them.
It's all right. The door's already shut.
Okay, okay.
There's only 5 of them, so.
Scott said it perfectly. Okay, but we will put it in compliance with the Well, I don't know, that's the way it's stated. That's what we
Derek's not feeling well, so. Derek's not feeling it? Okay. Must be some nasty bugs going around.
Got a fever.
Andrew should be in town
Oh, really? Wilson?
for a GIS panel,
Oh, okay.
and it meets at the same time as my class in Scheidler Hall.
No kidding. Wow.
Yep.
Did you get your credentials submitted today for your legal status, or is it you can do it?
I'll need to bring my passport.
Okay.
So I'll need to go over there between 8 and 5 and prove to them that I'm a citizen and I can work and I have residency here. Yep. And it's February 13th is when that panel is going to be.
Oh, okay. So not this week.
Networking event
Oh, okay.
tailored for GIS students.
I think he's done that several times.
City of Hilliard, City of Monroe, Esri, Miami, Valley Conservation.
Cool. Sounds like a good slate.
Yep.
Mike Dreisbach is wanting to do a demo.
8:30.
8:38.
There's no one else to take the time for one. I need a motion to come back into public session.
I move.
Second?
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Cheffin,
Yes.
Mr. Des George,
Yes.
Mr. Russo.
Yes. Okay, we're back in public session, ready for final decision and
Deliberation and
Deliberation and.
motion.
I motion that we grant the variance with the condition that the parking blocks are installed in the row of parking spots closest to the structure. And I also state that we accept the staff report and staff findings
on the decision criteria.
on the decision criteria, excuse me.
There's been a motion, is there a second?
I second that motion.
Been moved and seconded. Any other issues, discussion? I think that's a no, so let's have a roll call vote and on the motion.
Okay. Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
Yes?
Mr. Des George,
Yes.
Mr. Cheffin.
No.
Okay, so it's 3-1. The variance has been granted with the condition of the parking blocks and acceptance of the staff report on the decision criteria. Any other business before the board?
I just want to thank the board for close consideration. It's not your typical case, and very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn?
Move.
So moved,
Second?
seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Yeah, we're
adjourned.
another
We are
hour.
adjourned.